Raw podcast. I'm your host, Tino Kuda Tondarai Funzabaya. I ain't gonna repeat that. Here's a podcast that is creating a dialogue and a space for black men to be their most authentic selves. Now, my guest today is Reggie D Ford, and Reggie comes onto the podcast to talk about his book, Perseverance Through Severe Dysfunction. Once you hear this story, once you hear Reggie talking about his childhood and about the adversities that he faced and the resilience that it built in him, you're definitely going to be inspired. And so I really hope you guys enjoy this conversation with Reggie. I'll give you a little snippet of what you got to look forward to in this episode.
Write about the process of perseverance in my book. And I say the process of perseverance starts with pain. Right? Because in order to persevere, there has to be some pain point, some annoyance, some frustration in the beginning. And then you turn that pain into passion. That passion converts to purpose. That purpose then turns to power, where you're starting to walk in whatever it is that you've set your intentions on. And then ultimately you find peace. And I think that's when you complete that cycle, then that's like, oh, I persevered through this journey. And so And I had this outward appearance of, if you looked at my resume or my LinkedIn page, it looks like things are going great.
Yeah.
And it just felt like an imposter. I felt like an imposter. I felt like, here I am crying. I was bawling on the floor one night in a fetal position, like just I hadn't slept in weeks. I was hurt inside. And the world sees this and is congratulating me on all these different things. And I'm like, this isn't living. If that's what the world likes, then I don't want that. And so it's therapeutic. But I think when you go through things, when you experience stuff, it gets trapped in your heart and it gets trapped on the inside of you. And you have to have an outlet for that, or else it's going to eat away. And I like to say, don't bottle up emotions, because as we know, bottles can burst. And so I felt like I had, with a lot of different things in life, I had bottled it up. But sometimes I would turn and grab a pen and start writing. And
so now that you've watched, I've got a little bit of a snippet of what you got to look forward to in this episode. I just wanted to say thank you very much for watching this video, for clicking on it. I hope you enjoyed the conversation I had with Reggie. If you please go and like and subscribe, that would be amazing, and share it with your friends. You can follow me on any platform, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, TikTok, at Black and Raw. LinkedIn is my name, so just search for my name. So here is my conversation with Reggie D Ford. So Reggie, welcome to the Black and Raw podcast. It's really good to have you on.
Tino, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
No, it's blessed. How's your day been?
The day has been great. I can't complain. It's 10 o'clock in the morning here in Nashville. And so getting started Friday. It's snowing, which is weird because it was 70 degrees yesterday, but that's what you get here. So things are going good, though.
Oh, that's good, man. Glad to hear. Yeah, that's a bit of a spooky weather, isn't it? Sort of going from 70 to snow. It's like, what do I even do? Now I have to dress up for cold and for warm. It's not the one. But no, so I thought we'll just sort of get stuck in, and my audience will obviously find out a lot more about you during this episode. But I guess just sort of, I think maybe a good place to start would be maybe just your early childhood experiences. What was it like growing up? Have you always grown up in Nashville, or have you moved? Like, what's it been like?
So I've always been in Nashville. Nashville, Tennessee is born and raised, which is rare these days because Nashville's become this booming city where so many people are coming here and moving here from different places. And the city has evolved a lot. And I think just being here since I was born in 1991, seeing the evolution of the city and the evolution of neighborhoods. My neighborhood that I grew up in was marked by crime, poverty. We lived a similar lifestyle as many people around us, where it was tough to make ends meet at times. And it was tough in my household, being born to a very young mother. My mother was 14 years old when I was born.
Oh, wow. That is young.
Very young, baby. And on top of that, my grandmother was only 29 years old. And so today I'm older than my grandmother was. And I can't even imagine, I don't have any kids, but I definitely couldn't imagine having grandkids at this age.
Yeah.
And so, as you can imagine, having children, raising children, that creates a lot of struggle. And there were not many men in my life growing up. My paternal grandfather, so my paternal grandparents were very supportive in my life and helped out. But my father, he was in prison most of my childhood, and so that created its own struggles with trying to find that positive male support and having the nurturing that you needed from a man growing up. And and so, yeah, that was the early parts of my childhood. I looked at myself as the only child because I had half siblings that were across town, and then my mom, she eventually had other kids as well when I was 10 and 15 years old. So they were so much younger than me. It just basically felt like I was an only child for a while growing up in the house. But my mom stressed education. Neither of my parents graduated from high school, but I think they knew, well, my mom especially knew that education was going to be the key for me having a different life than what I had before. And and so I was, prepped for school way before I ever stepped foot in a classroom, which set me apart when I did eventually step into a classroom, which led to honors classes, which led to, more advanced curriculum, and then eventually landed me in a private school on the other side of town, which was totally like worlds away. It was probably 5 miles away from where I lived, but worlds away from where I grew up and culturally. And so that was a whole shift, and probably was the most difficult thing I'd have ever had to do with that culture shock. And again, growing up, there was trauma, there was struggle, but I had normalized that. I got comfortable with that. And going into this new world, it was just light years different. And I eventually, through a lot of coaxing and through just a lot of support, overcame a lot of those struggles. Academically, I did really well. Athletically, I did really well. I played football, basketball, and track. Always active in everything, the arts, music, everything. And, eventually led me to, deciding where I was going to go for college. And, the Ivy League schools were calling, Harvard, Yale, Penn, and all those type of schools. But I wanted to stay in Nashville. Again, my whole story's been here in Nashville. Yeah. And so I stayed here and went to Vanderbilt University and got a business degree and then got a master's degree in business as well, in accounting. And eventually started my career in finance, accounting. And yeah, so we could talk a little bit more about that, but that's kind of the early start to it all.
Yeah, no, definitely in detail as well. And thank you very much for sharing that. I think that'll be quite interesting for people to listen to. I wanted to sort of get into what you mentioned about your mum being 14 and that your dad wasn't away, and that you said you had a lot of struggles as well as you were growing up. So I don't know, how was it sort of being a child to someone that is parenting you, but is also a child? You know what I mean? Like, are those like lines blurred? And then if your dad wasn't there as well, did you have to be the man of the household, or did you have an expectation set on you and things like that?
I think early on, the lines were blurred in a way. And I've never been asked this question. That's a great question. Because when I think back to my childhood, I see me and my mom as being best friends, almost like siblings. And I think that was a component of being so close in age. And, looking at trauma, I look at, how a person is able to have a kid at 14, like what circumstances caused that. And it's sometimes it's just happenstance, but a lot of times there's trauma around that. There is, poverty leads to it. Drugs lead to it, sexual assaults and all of these different things may lead to it. And so I don't know my mom's full story, but I know that there was trauma in her life. And so with that, having trauma at whatever age it may have been, I think it stunts your emotional growth. And so I think when we were younger, we were very close and very tight knit. And, I think, I don't know if the man of the house, I never thought of myself as the man of the house, but I guess so, because I was the only man
The only
in the
man.
house. So I think that goes back to me normalizing my situation, not knowing what a traditional household looks like growing up. And so yeah, I think there was that component where the lines were blurred and it felt as if I was taking on responsibilities that other children my age probably wouldn't have had to take on.
Yeah, you would have been called I mean, I don't know if they've got it in the US, but here we have young carers. And that's sort of how they classify them, as just like kids that are sort of taking the load because their parents can't, maybe can't do so because they're disabled or because they've sort of not got a great background. And yeah, I feel like it's quite interesting because I know that probably builds a lot of resilience in you. And I feel like resilience is sort of built sort of through going through things, like going through life events, trauma events, and just sort of daily living. I guess, what is your resilience like? Because you've also mentioned that you had to transition from public school to private school. So I imagine, as you said, that was one of your hardest challenges. So you had to have some resilience, even at quite a young age, to be able to adjust to that. How was that adjustment as well?
Yeah, I mean, when I've asked people, well, not even just asked, but people have told me that one of the traits that stands out to them about me most is my resilience, and just being able to persevere through difficult challenges after difficult things and come out successfully. And I think, actually, I write about the process of perseverance in my book. And I say the process of perseverance starts with pain, right? Because in order to persevere, there has to be some pain point, some annoyance, some frustration in the beginning. And then you turn that pain into passion. That passion converts to purpose. That purpose then turns to power, where you're starting to walk in whatever it is that you've set your intentions on. And then ultimately you find peace. And I think that's when you complete that cycle, then that's like, oh, I persevered through this journey. And so I have persevered through, a rough neighborhood, a rough family situation. But then that transition to private school, which it's weird because on one side, I think many people from my neighborhood and from my family who didn't have exposure to the other side of town, being around wealthy white people, all of those things, they may have had a perception that my life was great because I got to go and experience all of those things. But at the same time, while I was there at the school, I was the anomaly. I was the poor kid coming from the hood who had all of this, adverse childhood experience coming with him. And I didn't talk the same language. I mean, we're in the same city, right? And you're in a whole different country across a big old body of water and I think we may have more things in common than the people that I was going to school with.
Yeah, probably.
And so it was difficult. Like academically, I adapted well, but culturally it was like waking up in the twilight zone. You make a joke and nobody understands it because your social reference is a different social point than theirs. And, there's just very few things to connect on. But I think one of the things that I've prided myself on most is one, staying authentic to who I am, despite what environment I'm in, but also my adaptability. And so a part of that adaptability was observing, watching, understanding, how do people move? How do people interact with each other? What are they doing? And then, starting to assimilate to that. And, but while staying true to who I am. And so it was a journey, and it took a while, and eventually found more people who had, bits and pieces of stories that could relate to mine, that it felt more like home. And in fact, my best friend to this day, he was the best man in my wedding. We met at that same school, and ended up finding out that we were in the same neighborhood. And so we ended up riding to school together once I started driving. And so it started to get a little bit easier, but I think it was a matter of adapting. And I think that's a part of being resilient.
Yeah, definitely. Like there's a, when you're sort of having to, I don't know if you've heard of it. I'm sure you may have had like code switching where you sort of,
Yeah.
where we have to sort of adapt to an environment where we're at. We can't sort of be ourselves.
Hmm.
But I like how you sort of said, and I imagine it was a journey sort of being able to sort of be in those spaces, but still be yourself.
Yeah.
I think for me, quite fortunately, well, fortunately and unfortunately, because the whole crux of sort of why I started this podcast was because I grew up in white areas. I grew up around white people. I didn't necessarily feel black compared to my black
Mm.
peers and stuff like that. But I think that upbringing, one, has brought this podcast, which is great. But then
Yeah.
two, it means that I can exist in both worlds and sort of I can still bring my personality and myself into a world which I've already been a part of. I remember actually someone I was at uni and one of my friends, I think it was a while after uni, but he was like, "Oh, Tina, I was always so jealous of how you could sort of just interact and
Mm.
be around white people and be because I went to quite a pretty white university." So he was like, I was always jealous that you could always do that. But then I was looking at him and I was like, I was always jealous that you could always be with the black people and that you could always
Mm.
sort of engage there. And even he said, we're talking about why we didn't join African Caribbean Society at uni. And he was like, oh, I felt like they were too black for me. And I was like, well, they're too black for you. They're definitely too black for me. It's always interesting in terms of being in places that you maybe don't feel like you can belong, but like that other people have a different perception as well. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I think so. Going back to that term code switching, I think it carries a negative connotation, almost like you're being inauthentic and not genuine to who you are. And I don't see what, and maybe that's the case for some people, but I think ultimately the way that I may show up in a white space versus the way I may show up in a black space, the only difference is probably the way that I enunciate and talk, and maybe some of the things that we talk about, because communication and culture are the things that are different. And so the culture is going to, I'm going to talk with a little bit more slang. I'm going to say things that a different phrase than I may have said it over here. But I don't consider it code switching in a negative way, because to my core, my beliefs are going to be the same. My values are going to be the same. And so, I'm not going to be a person over here where I am on this political side of the fence, or I have these beliefs about certain people, and then come over here and be the total opposite. That's not so I stay authentic to who I am. But I think it's very interesting, the concept of, too black for me. I grew up, and it took me a while. You said uni. I just call it college. But in college, my perception of that blackness was challenged. I read a book for an African American Studies class. It was called "Who's Afraid of Post-Racial America? 40 Million Ways of Being Black." And in that class, there were people from all over the world, black people, white people, but like black people from all over the world that had just different experiences, different upbringings. And what I had considered black, which was, shaped by my experience of growing up in inner city black Nashville, was totally flawed and not very fair to the experience of black people all over the world. And so it made me rethink something that I actually had believed for a really long time, was that when I came to that private school, that I was the only black person in my class. And when I look back, and I had forgotten about this because it was so long ago, but I started in the 8th grade. There was another kid who was half black, half Asian. And I reached out to him when I was publishing my book, because I had a little bit about just having that revelation, and asked him about it. And he told me that he didn't even consider himself black because he wasn't being raised by his black parent. He just was around a different culture. And so in his eyes, he didn't want to be, he didn't see himself as black. And so I've now started to correct how I tell that story and saying I was the only Black identifying person, right? So he didn't identify as Black, but he had Black and Asian in his body. And so I really started to look at, the vastness of Blackness and how beautiful it is that we are all unique. We aren't in just one little box. We can be multiple things.
Yeah, 100%. And I was listening to this podcast today. It's actually really interesting. If anyone that wants to listen to it, it's called The Grey Area. And they're talking about how can race be transcended, and which I thought was really just a really interesting conversation, actually, because they were talking about lots of things, but one thing which I think was really sort of applicable to this conversation is that, like, you can't synonymize one Black experience. Like, you've got, he was saying that, to be honest with you, he was saying when he grew up, he had more in common as a Black working class boy with Italian working class boys in the Bronx, even though they're in two different states. But then, like, you can have a completely different experience as a Black person being upper middle class or higher class. So they were saying that the conversation is never just one thing as well. We should always sort of think about, how does class involve? How does location involve? And all of that provides a unique experience for how a person lives. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. And I was just having a conversation about that with a group the other day, where we were talking about, the conversation was mostly on race. It was a book discussion. And I think the concept of white privilege came up, and looking at, how, just looking at the different, like, the gray areas that you're talking about, race is definitely a contributing factor to how certain people are treated, whether they're discriminated against, whether they do have privilege or not. But then also, like you said, class makes a difference as well. And so while a poor white person does have privilege in one category of race, especially here in America and maybe other places as well, they're poor, and so they don't have privilege in that area. And so there are commonalities when you look at, all of those different components and intersectionalities of a person's identity that shape the way that they experience the world.
Yeah, definitely. There's I can't remember who does it, but the woman that did intersectionality is blanking me now. My social work lecturers would be disappointed in me. But I guess also what I'd love to get onto as well, and sort of the meat of it, was you writing a memoir about your life experiences, about sort of how that has impacted you as well. So I guess, why did you choose to write a memoir? Was there thinking behind it? Did you sort of just want to tell your story, or why choose a memoir, I guess?
Yeah, I don't know if I chose it rather than it chose me, So I kind of left off right after college and telling the story of, I got into finance and accounting and had a really great start to my early career, which eventually led to me, I joined a wealth management firm, which was, again, light years away from anything that I had ever grown up with, understanding money, how to invest it, how to grow it, how to, pass it down and things like that. And there were experiences at that firm that I was at that were, again, culture shock as an adult. But I realized that I really liked the work that I was doing. I liked the service that I was providing for clients. And so I started a company, and the company was called Rose Creek Wealth Management. And the name derives itself from the metaphor of the rose growing out of a crack in the concrete, through all the perceived impossibilities of having, poor soil, no light, poor water, it grows, and we marvel at its tenacity to reach the sun. I think that's a whole story about perseverance. And I wanted that to epitomize the work that I was doing, the work that I had done, and highlight that not only in my life, but in the lives of my clients as well. And so I started the company, and it started off really well, doing great. And I was being featured in, Forbes, and getting recognized as top, 30 under 30, 40 under 40, you name it. And at the same time, I was going through the most turmoil internally than I had ever gone through in my entire life.
What was that turmoil?
Yeah, it was. So 6 months into starting the business, I was 6 months into marriage to, which was probably the business and the marriage were the highlights of things that were going on in my life. And then, but I had family dysfunction occurring. And so my grandmother, who is sitting over my shoulder right now, she's one of my angels. She's probably the most nurturing person I've ever had in my life.
Yeah.
She was diagnosed with terminal brain cancer. And so I was dealing with losing her and watching her deteriorate before my eyes mentally and then sometimes physically. And then with that situation came a lot of just dysfunction, chaos with other family members surrounding her passing, surrounding money that came along with her passing. And so I ended up falling out with my father. I ended up falling out with a lot of my family members because, again, coming from my profession and my background, I was trying to go about things and handle it professionally, which was my way of coping with everything that was going on. It's just like, can I just work and not feel this pain?
Yeah.
And because so many people in my family hadn't had the experiences that I had to understand that the things that I was doing, by the book was actually the best way to go about it. They turned on me. And, if I'm looking back, I would say for selfish reasons, but I can't really determine what their motives were.
Yeah.
And so that happened. And my father, who was in prison most of my life, he got out when I was about, or most of my childhood, he got out when I was about 18. And so we grew this bond for about 10 years where we were best friends and we would share everything together. And so when this happened, his mom was the one who was passing or who was dying of cancer. It really drew a wedge in between our relationship and just, really hurt. And then on the other side, my mom, we had been, growing apart, I think, after, me getting into the private school and then going to college and living a different life, probably a life she had intended on me living. But I don't know if the response was what most people would expect. I don't often hear I love you or I'm proud of you. I don't often hear those things. And so we had some tension in our relationship as well, which escalated and to this day with both my parents, there is no relationship. And so all of that was happening. And I had this outward appearance of, if you looked at my resume or my LinkedIn page, it looks like things are going great.
Yeah.
And it just felt like an imposter. I felt like an imposter. I felt like here I am crying. I was bawling on the floor one night in a fetal position, like just I hadn't slept in weeks. I was hurt inside, and the world sees this and is congratulating me on all these different things, and I'm like, this isn't living. If that's what the world likes, then I don't want that. And so the book really started off as a journal talking about my experience so that I could get it out of me, but then also seeing that it could help other people, knowing that life and success is all relative and different depending on who you are, and really wanting to tap into just how to persevere, how to overcome those hard times. And again, I talk about the process of perseverance. When you think that, the days are getting darker and you don't really enjoy who you are or where you are in life.
Yeah, you know what? I had even forgot I'd asked you about the memoir, and that's also I think that was perfect, sort of, because you were sort of describing what the turmoil was and sort of why you then had to come and write this book. As you're saying, it sort of chose you. I'm sorry to hear about your grandmother as well. She sounds like an amazing woman.
She was. Yes.
And I imagine that was hard, especially for your dad as well. Like, I know we never sort of think about sort of our parents and the past trauma they had and where that leads to, where that sort of impacts your relationship now. But even for him to have come out of jail, missed all of his child's life, missed the time he could have spent with his mother, then for her then to get brain cancer and then, unfortunately pass away. Yeah, I can't imagine what that does to somebody, to be honest.
Yeah. And I think the first draft of the book, I was still very much in it, in the anger, in the frustration. And so that draft of the book was probably much more judgmental and angry toward my parents. Whereas as the editing process went along, and as I, worked in my healing journey to understand exactly what you just said, just understanding their pain, their trauma, I think the book ends with a huge amount of grace toward everyone that I feel has hurt me, or myself. I have a lot of grace toward myself, because I think we often neglect ourselves when we talk about love and grace. And I have a huge amount of grace toward them, because I have a new understanding of, we are all victims of victims. That's a quote I heard recently. We are all victims of victims. And so while they hurt me, they were hurt by somebody, and the people that hurt them were hurt by somebody. And I think that's the intergenerational part of my book. Like, there's a huge theme of intergenerational trauma there, of understanding that it didn't just start right there. It didn't just start with my parents hurting me. Like, something happened to them. And when you have that understanding, it's easier to forgive. Like, not that you will forget and that you are tolerant of poor behavior, but it's easier to forgive, and it's easier to extend that grace. And I love my parents to death, and I'll say it every single day, but there are certain things that I just can't tolerate for my own well-being.
Yeah, you've got to put in your own boundaries. I listen to a lot of podcasts. I'm going to mention another one, but it's this TEDx talk, and it's talking about how do people stay sort of like the healthiest for longest, or live a long life or something. I'll put it into the show notes for people that want to listen. I can even send it to you. But they were talking about some of the happiest people were able to set boundaries, and were able to, and through those boundaries, they were able to have understanding and a grace for someone. They said in the thing though, like, if you think of someone right now, if you think of someone that's not doing enough, I'm actually skewing my different podcasts now, but it was basically
you listen to some good stuff. It sounds
yeah. The other one was what's his name? Honestly, Russel Brand with
okay.
Someone actually really good. I can't remember her now, but she talks about race and stuff like that, and she has a TED talk as well. But they're basically just saying that having boundaries and understanding that people are doing the best they can with what they've got, and we sort of need to accept that and understand, okay, if there are behaviors that people are doing that you don't necessarily agree with, you got to come with it with grace, and you got to come with it with, like, listen, that's not for me. This is my boundary that sort of protects me. And that's sort of a way of you can live. And I guess for our parents, or how we think about our parents or people that hurt us, they were sort of doing the best they could with the tools that they had. And sometimes I guess you have to put yourself in that shoe. Would you be like, if you were them and you had the exact same experiences, exact same everything, would you have done differently? You can't know, can you?
Yeah.
Really, the answer is probably yes, to be honest. No, probably you wouldn't have done any different. You probably would have made the same mistakes and the same stuff.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think one thing about my story people often ask is, what set me apart from the other kids that I went to school with, or the other people who grew up in my neighborhood. And I mean, there is a huge amount of luck. There's a huge amount of determination on my part, will and work ethic on my part, of course. But I think luck and divine intervention, opportunities that were presented to me that not everybody else gets presented. And so I don't discount those things when, because I did grow up in the environment of some people who are either in prison now or doing different things with their lives. And my life just went a different route. But it's not just because I was a better person. I'm not a better person than anyone. It was because different things came together in the universe that created this opportunity for me to achieve the things that I've achieved.
Yeah, no, definitely. And so I guess with the memoir, as you said, it was sort of a journal at first, and getting through all the stuff that you were going through. I guess, could you talk about, or maybe even reflect on, how sort of writing helped you process all those emotions and what was going on for you?
Yeah. Writing has always been my escape from life. And honestly, before I knew how to communicate this well verbally, I wrote, and I would write songs, I would write short stories, I would just write. And and so it has been therapeutic even before I knew it was therapeutic. But I think when you go through things, when you experience stuff, it gets trapped in your heart and it gets trapped on the inside of you. And you have to have an outlet for that, or else it's going to eat away. And I like to say, don't bottle up emotions, because as we know, bottles can burst. And so I felt like I had, with a lot of different things in life, I had bottled it up, bottled it up, bottled it up. But sometimes I would turn and grab a pen and start writing. And so that writing process, with what I would consider the most difficult part of my life, was me releasing so much stuff. And I remember when I first started journaling, it was about the situation that was occurring at that moment, right? Grandma's dying. I'm having to give her insulin shots. Nobody's helping. Where is everybody? Oh my gosh, I'm so pissed off. Like, it was stuff like that. And then my grandmother passed away, and I looked back at my journal entries, and I was like, wait a minute, how did we end up here? And so I started writing stories that I could remember. Where did me and grandma's relationship first start in my memory? Let's talk about that. Where did me and my father's relationship first start in my memory? Let's talk about that. And I started to just write as much as I could. And I think all of those things that I had bottled up for so long, and outside of my family as well, losing friends at, very young ages to murder or to prison or whatever it may have been, those things that I had left inside of me started to come out. And I think that release opened me up to so much more healing, because it wasn't, there was less shame because I had gotten it out. Because with trauma, there's shame. They're like best friends. They're always with each other. And there was less shame with getting it out. And once I got it out, and so it became this snowball effect of, how can I heal more? What else can I get out? And there's still stuff that is deeply suppressed and deeply repressed that hopefully will come to light so that I can heal from it. But it's a matter of doing the work.
Yeah, doing the work's the hardest part, isn't it?
Yeah.
We all have that, and even, I guess, the tools that you were saying in terms of writing and journaling can sort of, that's part of the hard work, isn't it? That's part of sort of the unlearning of the trauma, understanding what had happened. Did you ever have to go to therapy or anything, or like, was that part of your healing process as well?
Yeah. So the first time I had ever considered going to therapy, because, in Black families, it's like, no, don't, we're not going to therapy. Therapy's for white people. I'm not crazy. That was the mindset I grew up with. But when I met my wife, who happens to be white, she noticed she was studying pre-med. And so she had known some psychology and things like that. And, she suggested that I go to therapy, which was going to help our relationship, but more so just help me, because of some of the things that I was doing. And I think it was all, rooted in my insecurities and my fear of abandonment and rejection. And I initially agreed to go. And then I found out, a couple of days later, that she had told her best friend that I had agreed. And for whatever reason, the shame, right? The shame came up, and I immediately blocked it. I'm like, absolutely not.
Yeah.
And I was probably 20 at that time, 21 at that time. And I didn't step foot into a therapist's office until, I want to say, 28 years old. So it took about 7 years for me to finally say, okay, I really, really need this. And that came after my grandmother's passing. And the therapist was actually a grief counselor for me to talk about all the feelings that had come up with her death.
Yeah, no, definitely. 7 years. It's crazy how much shame can sort of just inhibit you. Like, it's sort of like, it's like, okay, no. And just the fact that your girlfriend told her friend, which girls talk anyway, don't they?
Yeah.
So it's crazy that shame can sort of, it can have a hold on all of us, and even things that people are afraid to admit. I was thinking, do I want to expose myself? But like, there's so many things which I would do, or I've done or do, and they have shame around them. So you don't want to share it. You don't want to address it either. You just want to sort of hide in your box and be like, no,
Yeah.
actually, I don't want people to know that about me because they'll think this about me or they'll do this about
Yeah.
me. And it can be quite restricting as well.
Right. Yeah. And even that thought process, right, of thinking what somebody else is going to think, that is a part of the shame. That is a part of this codependency of trying to please others when you don't have any control over that. I cannot, like, I have a talk that I give, and it's, I say, it's none of my business what you think about me. I have no control over that. It's none of my business. And you're going to think it regardless, right? I can stand up here and do all of these amazing things, and there's still going to be one hater in the crowd, right? It has no reflection of who I am, why I am the way that I am. And so if there is always going to be somebody out there that is a naysayer, I'm not honing in on that. I'm looking at all the great that I'm doing. I'm looking at the people that I'm helping. And so even thinking, oh, what is that person going to think? What are they going to say about me when I leave? Like, I try to eliminate that. And that's hard because we're social creatures and we operate in community. And a lot of times it depends on, I think this is part of survival of, being accepted by the community. But, oftentimes in these days, we don't need that same level of acceptance from a survival standpoint that we did when we were, first developing as a species. And so now it's just, it harms us. And so, yeah, I try to challenge that in myself all the time.
So yeah, I think what you said about in terms of caring about what others think and that shame and stuff like that, it's quite interesting. And oh my gosh, my mind just blanked. But yeah, I think that's quite important, and I think we should also be able to sort of see how shame is impacting us in our lives. And so with your memoir, obviously it's been released. When did you release it? Was it a few years ago?
Yeah, so I released it on Juneteenth in 2021. So June 19th, 2021. It became a bestseller. It opened doors to so many different things. So the title of the book, I don't think we've said it, but Perseverance Through Severe Dysfunction. PTSD is the acronym. So talk a lot about mental health. I talk a lot about social justice and some of the things that we've talked about today. And I look at there are these three themes that stood out to me as I was writing my story, understanding my story. The first was normalization, and how when you're stuck in the trauma, the pain, the whatever it is, how you begin to normalize that as a way to survive, right? Because if you look at your situation as extraordinary, it will eat you up. And so you normalize it. But then if you're lucky, you get to this point of realization where you are able to, be outside of that environment that is harming you or that harmed you, and look back and say that all those things that I had normalized aren't quite normal. And I think that happened multiple times in my life, where whether it was going to the school across town and seeing that life could be lived a lot differently than it was being lived at my house, or being the first person in my family to go to college and all of these other things, like I was able to realize that what I had normalized wasn't quite normal. And then the last phase is liberation. So you go normalization, realization, liberation, where you start to do some of the things to heal from that trauma that you had once normalized, going to therapy. And honestly, I've learned about so many different forms of therapy once I started to embrace it. Talk therapy is what we think of, like where you're sitting down with a person. CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, is what we think of. But I've done experiential therapy. I've done psychodrama, where we're acting and playing different roles of different people in our lives. Done art therapy. Even dance, yoga. I do so many different types of things to help heal, because a lot of those things have been hurt. And so it's that's kind of the three phases that the book goes through. But then again, honing in on that process of perseverance, turning pain into passion, passion into purpose, purpose into power, and power into peace. And that's the process of perseverance as I see it. And I speak on that. I talk to audiences. I talk to, everywhere from schools to corporate offices to sales teams, and I spread this message of persevering, of being vulnerable, of how to live an authentic life, because I think that is a part of that liberation piece that I've hopefully discovered and continue to live in.
Yeah. So you said normalization, realization, and liberation. I do love that
Absolutely.
alliteration, to be fair. That's pretty
Yeah.
good.
And with it being released on Juneteenth, which is a liberating day for, if those who don't know what Juneteenth is, it was the day that the last slaves that were in, I think, Galveston, Texas, were announced, were told that they were free. They had been freed, well before that, but the message hadn't gotten around back in the 1860s. And so it didn't get to them. And so on June 19th, they were told, and then it was this huge celebration to recognize that. And so it's all about liberation for people, liberation mentally, liberation spiritually, culturally, all of those things.
Yeah, and that's awesome, and that's all the place. That's the place we all want to get to, isn't it? To be at that liberation point.
Absolutely.
And I think what you talked about in terms of that, there's so many ways that you can heal, that you can do journaling, you can do therapy, and just therapy, the amounts of therapy you can do. I know children that were having Lego therapy, because with these traumas, especially as a childhood, they get repressed. And what's his name, Freud, for all his madness that he has and says, he says quite a lot of good things in terms of like our defense mechanisms, that we don't want to think about that trauma. That trauma doesn't want to go to our heads, because it's a survival instinct. You know what I mean? Just like how being liked by everybody used to be a survival instinct. I think the trauma that people go through, that's a survival instinct for them. And so I think for anyone listening, for anyone listening, to be fair, if you've gone through trauma, or if you know someone that has, it's hard to break down the walls that have been built for years, to break down the patterns as well that have been happening for people.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I, for anyone who has experienced trauma, I want you to know that you're not alone. I think a lot of people who have experienced trauma, especially trauma with abandonment of loved ones and things like that, oftentimes you feel isolated, like you're the only one going through it, but you're not alone. There are a lot of people who share similar stories, and it's definitely not the exact same story as you, but it can be similar and help you find a community of people that can help you heal. And I think just how we're hurt in some of our communities, we also heal in community. And that's something that I've been big on, is finding communities where I feel safe to heal.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess as black men as well, we don't have a lot of those spaces. And as men, we don't have a lot of those spaces. So it's also making sure we find some, and they can be anything, to be honest with you. They can be men's groups. I have a men's group, which I have been very poor at doing, which I need to continue with, because it's a space where we can be vulnerable and we can talk and we can discuss things like this as well, in depth. Or a sports team, or, this podcast is about sort of breaking stereotypes. You can go and be a part of a cookery class, or you can go and, if you like to knit, or, you know what I mean? Like, there's so many things you can do which have a community, which can be sort of quite supportive for you.
Absolutely.
Like, uncovering all these things that people have gone through.
Absolutely. Because I think it's about retraining the mind that the world doesn't have to be the bad place that your trauma told you it was. And so as you get around safe people, safe environments, and you condition yourself that, this outcome could be positive, this relationship can be positive, then you start to heal from those negative wounds that you've had.
Yeah, definitely. And so we're getting near to the end of the conversation. I just wanted to ask you just two more questions. With your book, with your memoir, you said that it's giving you so many opportunities. You're saying Forbes under 30 and Forbes under 40 as well. And
not Forbes. I'll correct that. They're not Forbes. They were Nashville 40 under 40 and 30 under 30.
I mean,
I did get nominated.
Great.
Yeah, I did get nominated for Forbes 30 under 30 though.
Nice. Just a shameless plug there. But no, I mean, even that, being recognized in your own state as well, and for the work that you're doing, which is brilliant. And so I guess what has sort of maybe been some of your highlights about being able to go to different places and to tell people your message? But then also I want to know maybe what's something that surprised you as well when you've been out.
Yeah, I think the the thing that I've loved the most is being able to connect with people on a deep level. And I don't think, well, maybe, I don't know, but most people, from my perspective, don't get the opportunity to hear, oh my God, like this last 60 minutes has changed the way that I look at life. Like you've helped me reimagine how life can be, or I've literally had direct messages, DMs in my social medias of people saying, man, I was in a really dark place, and hearing something from you really changed that, and gave me hope. Like that is what's the most fulfilling part of what I do now, of telling my story, of sharing, because you see the real impact. I see that people's lives are being saved by being vulnerable, by sharing my pain, and the process that I've taken to get to the place that I am, saving lives. I think that's the most fulfilling part of what I do now. And then I think I've been surprised by the types of people that my story has resonated with. I open the book up and I say, my hopes for the book are for those who can relate. I hope that you find, peace. Ultimately, I hope that you find peace. I hope that you realize that you're not alone, and that your trauma doesn't define you. Your past and pain don't define you. It's how you respond to that pain that defines you. But to those who can't relate, I hope it gives you a window into a world that may be unlike anything you've ever experienced. And my own, perception and bias and prejudice, I look at certain people and I think that they fall in one of those categories or the other. And it's been all over the board who can relate, who can't. And that's been the amazing part. The most surprising part for me is that, while I'm a 31-year-old young Black man in Nashville, Tennessee, people from the Philippines, people from the UK, people from Canada, old white women, young, it doesn't matter. Like different people who have different identities have resonated with the book in some type of way. And that's been just amazing.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. And I think you never really know who your work's going to touch, do you? Like you can be the most surprising of people. But I think that's sort of, I guess, the powerful thing about Medium in general is that it can go out to anybody and it can affect anybody. You might say, I want it to only impact this amount of this certain demographic, but I think there's things in your story, and I think there's things in loads of people's stories that you can always relate to. Like, I think for you, which is amazing, and I'm glad that your life has sort of come to where you are. And 31, you've still got plenty of time to do a lot of great things. But the fact that, you had a mom that was 14, you had a dad that was in prison, and you had lots of other things going on for you. And the fact that now you're able to be here, to have been able to reflect, to been able to persevere and have that resilience, I think is amazing. And I think people listening to your story will be able to definitely be like, if Reggie can do it, why can't I? You know what I mean?
Absolutely. And that's what I hope. I have young folks who reach out and say, man, I want to do things like you did. And I'm like, you're going to do things better than I did it. You're going to reach heights that I never even reached. So that's the hope. Give people hope.
Yeah, no, definitely. And so the final question, which I always ask all of my guests, say if there's a young Black boy that's listening to this conversation, how can something that we've talked about, or just something that you sort of know, can help them with an understanding of themselves?
Yeah, I would say one, start with just looking at what hurts you, because I think a lot of times as men, as boys, we get told to toughen up, man up, and that's just not being human. So if you're a human, it's to be human is to feel emotion. To be human is to have pain and painful experiences. And so understanding when those experiences happen, and then trying to figure out what caused that experience to happen. Right? Was it because I didn't like the way that someone said something to me? Well, how can I get that out of me? That maybe I write it down and say, I didn't like the way that so-and-so said so-and-so to me. I don't really understand why I feel the way that I do, but I feel this. And know that your feelings are real. No one can argue with your feelings. No one can say that your feelings aren't real. You're validated in everything that you feel, and just really understanding that to be a boy, to be a man, means to experience life just like any other human.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think that's a great place to one, end the conversation, but two, for people to start with as well. Because you got to know what's going on for you. You got to be able to be like, okay, if you can highlight where your hurt is coming from, you can be like, right, how do I deal with this? How do I put boundaries in place? How do I start to even think about what's going on for me? So yeah, no,
and
thank you.
I'll add
Go on,
one
go
more
on, go on.
one more thing to that, because I think it's been so important in my life is for everyone. I hope that you find just unconditional self-love and grace. Like that is the root of it all. If you can find absolute unconditional self-love for yourself and provide yourself grace for those times that you may mess up, you'll be a much happier, healthier, and in my eyes, successful person.
I don't even need to add anything onto that. No, brilliant, brilliant, brilliant. Reggie, thank you very much for joining me on the podcast. I've loved meeting you and talking to you. Hopefully we can do this again as well.
Absolutely. Thank you, Tino. I appreciate it.
Let's have a good day, Reggie.
Take care.
So, that is the end of the episode. I really hope you guys enjoyed that episode. I really enjoyed talking to Reggie. I think Reggie's story is really inspiring, and I think anybody can listen to it and get some inspiration for themselves. And so, if you like this episode, please comment. Tell me what you thought in the comment section. And please go like and subscribe. It helps the podcast grow, helps this channel grow. So yeah, tune in soon, guys. We'll have more episodes coming out for you next week. So thank you very much, and we'll talk soon.